You wanted to talk about Freiburg, Stefan. They have a phenomenal start to the season. They are going to Leipzig, and of course, I just spent a few days in Leipzig. My Substack is just out on Jürgen Klopp and what he will potentially add to that club. And yes, it's a multi-club role that he's taking on, right? He is officially going to be in charge of three different clubs. I thought it was really fascinating how everyone I spoke to at Leipzig often pointed out that he wasn't just there signing, but really also pointed out that he was coming to Leipzig, Stefan, which makes me kind of think that maybe he's going to be more hands-on there than we maybe suspected initially, which is obviously potentially good news for them. It's going to be interesting to see how that's going to work with this entire setup, right? We talked about Leipzig yesterday and their Champions League game and the immaturities that led to them to lose to Liverpool. This is going to be, Leipzig against Freiburg, German Cup final 2 years ago as well. This always kind of feels like a class war, right? Because you have the former Christian Streich here, Julian Schuster is now in charge, and he's done such a phenomenal job kind of taking on that heritage. But it always feels like this class war of this like alternative, I don't want to say hippie club because that's not quite fair, but there's like alternative club that's like more into like alternative healing teas and etc. Because Freiburg is where people walk around bare feet because it's a student town, that kind of stuff. And then you have on the other side, you have the mega conglomerate Red Bull Leipzig factory team to say. So this feels like such a match of contrast, Stefan.
Yeah, it is. Obviously, it's a traditional club against a plastic club, if you want to use the terms that Freiburg would use, or maybe if Matt Ford was here, he'd probably use to describe this fixture. But yeah, Freiburg, I think, deserve a huge amount of credit. They've been, we've talked about them in moments throughout the season, and the kind of job that Julian Schuster is doing there, and I just think it's tremendously impressive the way that he's managed to take over from Christian Streich and in many ways actually improve them, to be honest with you. If you kind of look at their stats, they're defending better, they're playing better with possession, they're holding on to the ball more, they're scoring more goals, they're creating more chances, counter-attacking better. They're not exactly a team that presses particularly strongly, but they just seem very, very well coached. And, that could also be a case of Schuster basically coming in and Christian Streich handing him a big folder and saying, here's the game plan, just make sure you follow these rules and you'll be fine. And that certainly could be the case, because I wouldn't say they're terribly different from what we saw last season, except for the fact that they probably are defending a lot better. But, I think you could probably say that even if Streich had probably sticked around, they probably would have bounced back in some form, just because that's the kind of nature of Freiburg. They obviously, they have good seasons and they have bad seasons. But they've done very well in terms of the signings. We talked about Aaron Dinky at the start of the season, actually, when we were talking about, I think maybe we did a piece on Werder Bremen and how they managed to let him slip through their fingers. He's doing very well. The right winger, he's already got 2 assists. Patrick Osterhager, who actually came from Bochum, centre midfielder, who's doing tremendously well for them, and is actually perhaps a good kind of segue into what I think is probably at the heart of Freiburg's impressive start. If you kind of look at the stats so far this season, in terms of, like, for example, Freiburg's defensive stats, they've got the 4th best record in the league, behind Bayern, Union Berlin and Leipzig, and you think, okay, that's impressive, but, not that great. But if you then kind of actually then look at their expected goals against, so not so much the goals they're conceding, but the chances they're conceding. And if you actually filter out penalties, they've actually got the 2nd best record in the league, and only Bayern have conceded fewer chances than them. So I think that probably goes some way to kind of illustrating where their success has been. And then you only have to kind of look at which players are making the most interceptions in the Bundesliga this season. At the very top is Lucas Kubler, defender at Freiburg. 11th place is Maximilian Eggestein, midfielder. He's at 11th. And 18th, you've got Philipp Leinhardt, defender, and then in 24th, just as making it into the top 25 is, as I mentioned, Patrick Osterhager, who came from Bochum. So, I think you've got a very, very kind of impressive defensive structure there. You could even then kind of look at other things as well, but I think, for example, I'm trying to remember who it was that stood out to me in terms of, attacking players who actually. Oh yeah, sorry, it's Ritsu Doan. Sorry, the right winger. Like he's done tremendously well in terms of being an attacking player who also kind of doubles up as a kind of defensive player. The left hand side has been really impressive as well in terms of tackles won, interceptions won, and it just kind of says to me that they've just kind of got a very kind of impressive defensive structure that's gone about winning games that they're probably expected to win. To be perfectly honest with you, I mean, if you go through the whole team, they've had a very difficult start where they played Stuttgart and Bayern Munich. They managed to pick up an impressive 3-1 win over Stuttgart, which maybe, now that we know the way that Stuttgart played this season wasn't terribly unexpected, since we've seen Stuttgart drop a lot of points this season. But beat Stuttgart, lose to Bayern, beat Bochum, beat Heidenheim. Again, a surprise defeat to St. Pauli, but then they beat Werder Bremen and Augsburg. So they are picking up the points they're kind of expected to pick up. And, that's not to kind of sound disparaging, because I think that's actually a very underrated aspect of modern football, where as long as you pick up the points you expect to pick up, you'll be where you have to be, and then that's where you can use that as a jumping off point to maybe overachieve. And equally, you can't overachieve without picking up those points. So I think Schuster deserves a huge amount of credit for doing exactly that. And in fact, that's more or less why I do the managerial power rankings that I do, because it kind of underlines which head coaches are more or less doing their job, as opposed to maybe picking up the odd fantastic win and then dropping points where they shouldn't do. But what really intrigues me is that they've then obviously got this difficult run coming up. They've got RB Leipzig this weekend, which will probably be, aside from Bayern Munich, I'd say probably the toughest test in the Bundesliga so far. They've got Mainz at home, which you'd expect them to beat, but then they've got Union Berlin, they've then got Borussia Dortmund, and then they've got Gladbach before we get into December. So I'll be really interested to see how they do in those 4 or 5 games, because, as I said, they're doing very well to pick up the points against teams below them in the table, which is very, very similar to Christian Streich. And, the last kind of 2 or 3 seasons, I often found myself saying, because it was true, that Streich's teams are very good at picking up points against those teams. It's when they came up against teams against the top 4, top 6, for example. I think, if I'm not mistaken, they've got a dreadful record against RB Leipzig, if I'm not mistaken. It's those games that kind of tells the difference. So it'll be interesting to see if Schuster's going to change things up, and if he can kind of change that aspect of Freiburg's game, because I would maybe hint that, not to try to end on a negative here, but I would say these next kind of games coming up will be tougher tests for Freiburg, and it'll be interesting to see if they can kind of keep this good start going.
I mean, it's so very fascinating, isn't it, that after more than a decade in charge, Christian Streich steps down, and I think for a lot of clubs that transition would have been very, very hard. Most famously, Alex Ferguson comes to mind, right, where he leaves, and I mean, it's to the present day that you feel the impact of his departure. You look at Germany. Otto Rehhagel was in charge for a very long time in Werder Bremen, and it took Werder, I think, 3 or 4 years to really get over his departure in the 1990s, and Freiburg have been there before with Volker Finke. When he left, there's a few years of a little bit of turmoil until Christian Streich comes in. But this is kind of a very much more seamless transition, isn't it? Julian Schuster just comes in and picks up the points. And with this discussion, I'm curious what you think about it, and actually the listeners too, if you want to comment and see what you think. With this discussion on this media trip among us journalists on how much the impact is of a head coach at a club and the performances of a team. And we came kind of to like the conclusion it's about 40%, because 40% is quite a bit, right? But that 40% also means that like you can't just hire Pep Guardiola and parachute him into like a team like Bochum, and all of a sudden they're going to beat like everyone around them, right? Because like the infrastructure and everything has to be around him. He needs to have the right players, etc. And I think Christian Streich just left such a fantastic foundation. And then of course Julian Schuster is the right person to do so and take over. That really, that I think is why this worked so well, because I think the club set up such a good system for whoever was going to come in next to just kind of take over and kind of seamlessly transition Freiburg into a new era. There's been some changes, right? I mean, Adamu, for example, the striker, who got very little time under Streich, is blossoming now under Schuster. So these are like the little fine details and adjustments that people will make when they get into a new job. But I think what really fascinates me is how easy and seamless all of this was, Stefan.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think you can even just kind of go through that Freiburg squad and see a number of kind of senior kind of elder statesmen, if you will, of Christian Streich's reign at the club. Obviously, Christian Günther, Vincenzo Grifo, even Maximilian Philipp is obviously a seasoned pro in the Bundesliga, Matthias Ginter, Michael Gregoritsch. You can go through all the way through that team. And they're all players who knew exactly how to play and what was expected of them at Freiburg under Christian Streich. And as I said a moment ago, I wouldn't say they've really changed too much up in terms of the formation and tactics. I think Schuster's just been an excellent kind of successor to that. But, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, you kind of wish them well and you hope they do well this season, but it'll be interesting to see what happens when a lot of these kind of players move on. They do have a number of exciting young players. There's obviously the goalkeeper Noah Atabolo, who has picked up a lot of headlines in Germany for being an exciting young goalkeeper. As I mentioned, there's Dinky, there's Noah Weishart, the left winger, who's done tremendously well. I mentioned Osterhager is only 24, the central midfielder. So, they do have Ritsu Doan as well, is only 26, is a very big player for them. So it's not to say that they're an old team with one who are still kind of running off the fumes of the previous administration or anything like that. But it's important, I guess, that the succession plan will last longer than a season. It'll be Schuster not only making sure that he steadies the boat this year and kind of gets him into respectable position and relies on these kind of older players who more or less probably still just kind of going through the motions of what they've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years under Christian Streich. But it'll be also important that long term Schuster knows how to replace these guys, when to replace them, and how to do so in a way that means that when these guys start moving on, the wheels don't start to come off for Freiburg, which might even just be a case of this year when some of these guys start picking up injuries, whether Freiburg do start to kind of drop points. But I guess what I would say is, so far Schuster's more or less done a perfect job, but bigger tests, I suppose, are on the horizon.